everybody, and welcome to Meet the Authors. My name is Deborah Burton, and I'm the Managing Director of the DevOps Agile Skills Association, and do I have a treat for you today. Now, you might be noticing that the seat next to me, where my author would be sitting, is empty, but you hold tight because he's going to be joining me via video very shortly. And who is the speaker today? Well, my author is Jan Bosch, and he's the author of Speed, Data, and Ecosystems, Excelling in a Software-Driven World. And let me tell you, it is a must read. We cover so many different topics. We talk about speed and the importance of it. We talk about data and, of course, ecosystems. But we talk about much more in terms of how companies are trying to move and get charge of their transformational journeys. So get ready, get set, because we're going to go. Jan, again, thank you for joining us. We're so excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today. One of the things before we get started, I thought it would be nice if you just introduce yourself a little bit more to the audience for me.
Absolutely. I'm a professor of software engineering at Chalmers University of Technology. I run a center called software-center.se, which is a collaboration between 13 large international companies such as Ericsson, Volvo Cars, Volvo Trucks, Saab, Bosch, Siemens, Datapack, those kind of companies, and 5 universities. And the purpose of that center is to accelerate the pace of digitalization in the software-intensive systems industry. So that's my primary job. And next to that, I do a little bit of consulting and I spend some time in the startup community.
Okay. Well, I mentioned this to you when we were putting this together, that you sound like a very busy person doing a lot of things in addition to writing great books that I'm very excited to be talking about today. One of the things before we get started, I was hoping that you could explain to the audience the title of Speed, Data, and Ecosystems for us.
Yes. So if I look at the digital transformation as is happening, there are, to me, 3 main factors that are influencing especially the digitalizing industry or the software-intensive systems industry. The first is speed. We have to get much faster in being able to translate identified customer needs into solutions that are delivered in the hands of customers. And that is what the speed part is about. Mm-hmm. The second part that we spend a lot of time thinking about is data. In many companies, decision-making is very much driven by opinions, beliefs, past experiences, etc., and not very much driven by data. And what we see is that the most successful digital online companies have an enormous tendency to take data-driven decisions. And I believe that that's something that needs to be adopted in the industry as a whole. Mm-hmm. And then the final part is that many companies have a tendency to do everything in-house by themselves, without using the ecosystem, the business ecosystem or the software ecosystem around them in a strategic fashion in order to make sure that they put their energy on the things that are most valuable to them, what they are best at in the world, and rely on other partners in order to get the things that for them are more commoditized. So that is the combination of those 3 factors is what I now see is what many of the companies in the software center and other companies that I work with are struggling with.
Yeah, at one point you made a comment in your book, if folks hadn't heard of big data, they must be living under a rock. So you find that data, of the 3, are you finding that data is the most prolific piece of it, or is a combination of all of it?
So, and that's, I think, what I'm trying to do in the book. It is all those things have to come together. Mm-hmm. And of course, since I published the book, the notion of AI has really come up quite significantly. Yes. And for everyone who has looked into AI, we know that data is a big factor. Because I need the data in order to train my machine learning or my deep learning models. So I think that what you're raising is that putting data at the center is, I think, one of the very important things. And it was a very astute observation by you, that I think even though everyone is complaining about that the agile transformation is difficult and adopting continuous integration is hard and DevOps is not easy, etc.
Correct.
It's all in service of a bigger goal, which is data-driven decision-making and being able to use the data that I collect from my products in the field, from my customers, from others, in a way that generates that reinforces existing business value
Right.
and creates new mechanisms for monetizing that I didn't have earlier.
Right. Well, one of the things, and so forgive me for doing this to you, but right at chapter 2, when you talk about trends in society, business, and technology, this first paragraph caught me right away because it made me think about how things have changed from a technology perspective. So bear with me for a second. You wrote, whether one agrees with the development or not, the fact of the matter is that the world is moving faster. Customer adoption of new products and service have consistently been increasing in speed. It took the telephone around 75 years to reach 50 million users in the US, whereas the internet reached 50 million users in 4 years. More recent, the game Angry Birds space reached 50 million users in 35 days. That says something about what technology is doing and how it's changed us, yes?
Absolutely. No, I think that is one of the key things that companies are struggling with these days. That if many companies use the fast follower strategy, so they let others do the innovations, and when it proves to be successful, they follow whatever an innovation leader is doing. But if you have such adoption speeds, where adoption speed is measured in days or in weeks or even a small number of months, that really causes companies to think differently about how they innovate, how they differentiate, and how they keep themselves relevant. And what I get a lot is that people say, yeah, but Jan, Angry Birds, who cares about Angry Birds? But it's an indicator of a trend that is not just true for Angry Birds, it's also true for smartphones and what we now see happen in IoT or the wearables or any other technology. If you deliver something that is of value to customers, customer adoption has never been faster. And I think that that's one of the key things to realize.
I love that you say that simply because one of the things that when I'm around talking and on stage talking to folks is what's driving this adoption are the consumers. We're driving it. We are so used to these wonderful mobile devices that, we've gotten used to over the last 20 so years that we and the services that we have here, we don't want to give back and we don't want to go back to the way it was, right? So the need for speed and the need for continuous delivery, innovation are important to us as consumers.
Yes.
So when that doesn't happen, we're no longer interested in the solution.
Exactly. And I think that you're putting your finger on one of the key factors. The difference between traditional atoms-based products, so where you have mechanical engineering or electrical engineering, is that the innovation cycles were measured in typically years. Even in the iPhone, maybe once a year comes out with a new model. But if we look at software, everything that is bits-based, we can have innovation cycles that are maybe 2 orders of magnitude faster than what you can have with anything that is atoms-based. And that is what is driving, why is everything moving to software? Why is digitalization such a big thing? Because the pace of innovation that you can have with bits-based technologies is at least 2 orders of magnitude faster, 100 times faster than what you can do with anything that is atoms-based. Because when it comes to atoms, you have to manufacture it somewhere. Well, first you have to mechanically design it, and then you have to manufacture it somewhere, and then you have to ship it, and then you have to get it out to the customers. Whereas with the internet connectivity and the services that we have these days, we're literally talking about seconds or minutes between an engineer pushing the button, having finished the design, to a user actually getting an updated version of the software.
Yeah, and that's the speed of it, right? But then there's also that side of, from a software-driven world, how do you get your people ready. And that's one of the things I also really enjoyed about the book. Number one, let me step back a second. The way you wrote the book is you made it available. When I was thinking about your target audience, well, I think anyone who's interested in understanding technology and understanding what's happening in the software world, this book is a valuable thing for them to read. What I liked is that you really thought about your audience and you put together a kind of a guidance for what are you reading. So if you're interested in this much information, you should read this chapter and this chapter. If you want more detail, you should read this and this. And I found that very, very valuable. But it is kind of an addictive read because once you get started, you really want to understand those different details of, data, speed, and ecosystem. And you cover that very well in the book.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
So one of the things I would like to talk about is the kind of more of a deep dive on each of them. So when we talk about speed, can you talk to me about why that's so important in this day and age, the speed aspect?
So I think we were getting into that a little bit earlier. One of the key enablers for faster innovation cycles is to be able to get to a state where I have actually DevOps or continuous deployment in place. For companies that start with traditional waterfall style development, and we've studied this with dozens of companies, and that's where the Stairway to Heaven model shows how we have experienced companies evolving. So this is not something that we made up. It was a generalization of a description of how we see companies work in practice. And what we see companies do is that they start with traditional development. And the first step after that is that they adopt agile development practices. So they adopt agile teams, they do sprint planning, they work in sprints, they have daily stand-ups, and the idea basically is to get to a state where at the end of every agile sprint, I in principle have a deployable, or at least I've added complete functionality to the system that is available.
Right.
In traditional many companies, at that point, the agile teams are quite frustrated because even though they are working in sprints, the department that does quality assurance most certainly does not work in sprints. So they are used to waiting for the software developers to say, we're done with the system, go and test. And they're not ready for that. So the next stage after that is then continuous integration, when the R&D organization and the quality assurance organization start to partner in order to make the quality assurance occur at the same pace as that software development is occurring. And then you typically run into a situation that you have to adopt many of the automated approaches towards testing, whereas many traditional companies have often had manual testers of different styles. Once you're done with continuous integration, it means that your product is always at production quality. Very different from waterfall style development, where you typically would test the quality back in at the end of the waterfall development period. So you're always at production quality. And then people start to realize that if I have finished software on the shelves that is valuable to customers, because why else would I build it? The next step becomes, why not give it to them right away? Why should we wait for the next release cycle, which maybe is 6 or 9 or months away? Why not give it to them right away? And that's when you then move towards continuous deployment. But every time you see that also around continuous deployment, and this is where DevOps comes in, but around continuous deployment, you see that many of the processes around deployment have traditionally been manual, have been rather effort consuming, and have caused quite significant downtime at the customer.
Well, that has to do with the silos, right? I mean, when you take about the waterfall approach, many of the people that were intrinsically important to the value chain of building their product or service were in different departments, all building parts of it. And having a lot of different cultures and managers and tools and things like that.
And a tendency to communicate through documents and throwing things at the wall, instead of what we're, I think, both advocating, which is multidisciplinary teams. We have product manager, UX, development, architecture, and testing, all those skills present in an agile team, so that an agile team can take something from an identified customer need all the way to delivering it as part of the product. After continuous deployment, however, there's the next step, which I think we're going to talk about once we get to data.
Yes.
The moment I can do continuous deployment, you can start to use your R&D system as an innovation system, because then you can start to do things like A/B testing. So you realize two versions of a feature. You get version A out for some group of customers, version B out for another group of customers, and you can then start to measure in the field which of these things actually performs better and which one performs worse.
Yeah, and that's powerful, right? Because what that tells you is what's working well and what's not working. So you deploy what's working well, and that will bring the most value.
Exactly. And I mean, I'm not sure when I should bring this in, but what many people don't realize, and I'm going to do a quick math example for your audience.
Great.
Imagine you have a company that has, typically the R&D budget is expressed as a percentage of revenue for most companies. Okay. So if we put it at 5%, that means that every dollar that goes into R&D has to generate $20 of business value.
Okay.
Now, let's go into an agile team. An agile team has, say, 8 people and has a 3-week sprint. That means 24 person weeks of effort gets spent every sprint. If we assume, and this is a relatively low number, but let's assume that they have a person year cost $100,000. It's less it's more in most companies, but let's assume that. That means that an agile team costs $50,000 per sprint. But how much business value should that team
get?
20 times $50,000. Now, help me out. I think that's $1 million. So that's $1 million. So every agile team, every agile sprint has to generate $1 million of business value. How do we make sure that customers are indeed experiencing $1 million of value for every agile team, every agile sprint?
But even that, how is that measured, right? I mean, how are they measuring that?
Yeah, so and that depends then on the industry. So if you are an e-commerce online company and you know what the conversion rate is for your business, and there are companies even in the Netherlands that are doing this extremely well, they know how much even a per mil in conversion is worth for them, because they know how many people come in. And if I can increase conversion with 0.1%, that can be, depending on the company, tens, hundreds, or even of thousands of dollars, or even millions of dollars, depending on the company. So for embedded systems, so for software as a service companies online, it's often more easy to measure.
Right.
The challenge is that we want to bring this to other organizations too. We want to bring this to banks, we want to bring this to telecommunication companies, to automotive companies, etc., etc. And that requires a thinking about value, which then leads to what we call a hierarchical value model, where you start with business level KPIs and you break those down into lower level factors that become measurable at the team level, so that the team knows that if they drive up one factor or improve one factor, that this will have an impact, a measurable impact on business KPIs as well, even if it's not entirely clear how this works. But we're sliding into the data part of the book now, so I'm not sure if that's what...
I know, and that is great, because that's exactly where I want us to go next, is making that connection. So we understand speed and we understand some of the limitations with it, but also the benefits of the speed and the way to bring new product features, new capability faster to who? To you and me, to the consumers, which we love, right? We love that. But the data piece now, what's the superpower there?
Yes. Our research shows, and there is also other people that have looked into that somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of all the features and functionality that gets built in systems is either never used or used so seldomly that it shouldn't have been built in the first place. And the data part comes in there, that whenever someone in product management or a very loud customer or whatever has an idea about a feature, we want to get to a situation, which I describe in the book in the HYPEX model, the hypothesis experimentation model, where we get to a state where we build a thin slice of the feature. deploy the feature, including instrumentation to be able to measure the effect of that first slice of the feature, get data back from the field, whether that feature actually delivers any value, and then decide based on the data that comes back whether we should continue to invest in that feature or not. And imagine, for all the R&D managers that are watching this afterwards, imagine that half the people that you have are doing useless stuff that no customer cares about. And imagine that you could come up with tools to actually measure. Yes, exactly. And you could come up with mechanisms to actually measure who is doing that. And even if you could bring the 50% down to 25%, that would mean freeing up a quarter of your people for value-adding stuff. That's huge. Right. And still, many companies are struggling with the transition from opinion-based decision-making to data-driven decision-making.
Yeah, and I think right there is the conundrum, right? How do they get from point A to point B? How do they transform themselves so that they can bring all this additional value to their products and services to their customers?
Yes. And again, there we have defined a number of stages, and I will not go into too much detail on that, but what we typically see is that R&D teams have to take the initiative. Stephen Covey in his book, this is 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, talks about your scope of control, your scope of influence, and your scope of concern. So what we have seen is that in almost all cases, it is the R&D teams that within their scope of control start to instrument their part of the software and start to collect data. Often they have to, one of my rules in life is it's much better to ask for forgiveness than for permission. Yeah, so
absolutely.
You often have to do a few things that are maybe not entirely approved by legal at certain times. Not that I'm advocating for that.
I hear you.
But and what we then see is that once R&D teams are able to get data back and prove to the next circle, which is typically other R&D teams, architects and product managers, how much value you're able or how much insight you can gather from that, then what you typically see is that the scope at which a company works data-driven starts to expand.
And how empowering is this for the teams that's happening that are not asking for permission but are out there and figuring it out? How empowering is that?
It's amazingly empowering. In the most advanced online companies that we work with, we are now in a situation where teams have complete autonomy on what they're going to build next. All they have gotten is a set of output metrics, a number of success metrics that they are asked to improve. So basically, you're responsible for this part of the websites. Your goal from the coming quarter is to get conversion from, 3.2% to 3.4%, and you have full autonomy on how to do that. Even if you're not that far yet, we have a company in Software Center where the R&D team now, whenever a product manager comes to them and says, I would like you to build this feature, immediately returns with the question, what problem does it solve and how do we measure that it solves it? Which of course puts the product manager a little bit on his or her back, pushes them back a little bit, but it is the start of a conversation of what is it that we are measurably looking to improve in the system that delivers value to customers, which I think is critical.
So, but how difficult is that for the senior leaders in the company to encourage that type of thinking and innovation and give up a bit of control in that sense? Do you run across that?
All the time. And there are, I think, 2 main reasons why this is happening. The one is that many senior leaders come out of an engineering discipline, typically mechanical engineering or electrical engineering, which is driven by a traditional waterfall style based of development, way of development, for all kinds of right reasons. Putting the factory together is very expensive. Once you commit to a certain chip design, you can't really change it because it costs fantastically much to get it actually on silicon, etc. So for all the right reasons, they have grown up in a certain culture. And then moving to this new culture and understanding how it operates is for them often very, very difficult. The second part is, and for all the senior leaders that are watching this, this is perhaps a little bit uncomfortable. In most organizations, the higher up you are in the chain, the more risk averse you tend to be. Because very often people get promoted to a higher level position by their boss, and their boss, the last thing that he or she wants is trouble. Yes, so you pick someone you think is reliable in that position, who is not going to cause you to sit in hour-long video or telephone conferences over the weekend because some crisis has exploded. So in many traditional hierarchical organizations, the higher up you are in the organization, the more risk averse you are, which then makes it even more difficult. That doesn't free teams from the obligation to try to change their management. But how do you do that? You don't do it by PowerPoint. You don't do it by badgering them with requests. What you do is you create evidence. You collect so much evidence in your scope of control that you can convince the next layer that what you're proposing to do is basically risk-free. And if you do that, then over time you can grow in the organization.
You know, when you describe that, when we started DASA, what we saw at the time, it was business unit managers, brave business unit managers that were adapting Agile and beginning to change the way that they had traditionally worked and began organizing their teams differently. And because they were trying to seek results, because there's a big pressure out there that if you don't move quick enough, then there's a lot of venture capitalists out there in Silicon Valley with a lot of money looking for the right thing to either disrupt the current industry or to create a new industry that will make you obsolete. So these business unit managers started it. And I think in a lot of the companies that I have seen, the senior level executives were looking at what they were doing. And then they began to take notice of the successes and failures. And then the adoption became much easier for the folks in those organizations.
But the one thing that you mentioned is whenever you try something new, not everything is successful.
Correct.
In A/B experiments as well, for companies that are very good at A/B experiments, the vast majority of A/B experiments does not lead to a positive outcome. It's only a smaller number of them. And in many organizations, as long as you're successful, you get a lot of leash. But the moment that there is a failure that costs the company something, then things start to become more difficult. And the fact of the matter is, whenever you change an organization, there will be things that go well, and there will be things that don't go so well.
Right.
Of course, there's a saying in management, you know, if something is not successful, we just redefine success. But it's, of course, a bit of a factor that I see in many, at least especially European companies, evolve, that there is a level of risk aversion because the consequence of failure are very high in the culture of the company.
Yeah, and that's why you hear a lot of the DevOps folks saying, fail fast, right? You know, fail fast, get back up, get on the horse, run again.
And the hope that no one else noticed it.
Exactly, but keep it undercover.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly what we're looking for here.
But I've also seen a bit of a transition in the last 3.5, 4 years, where in the past, people weren't really talking about what they were doing. It was kind of let's keep this secret to ourselves. It's about our success. And now you're seeing more and more people talk about it. And I think that's another reason why your book is so compelling to read, because of the companies that you're associated and the research that you've done, you're actually sharing what that experience is. So that's very powerful.
And I must say that the software center that I mentioned in the introduction, we have 13 companies. The companies explicitly claim that only 50% of the value of software center is the research that we do. The other 50% is the knowledge exchange between the companies. That has proven to be extremely valuable. And we have lots of situations where companies either visit each other one-on-one or organize larger knowledge exchange sessions that are extremely valuable for them. And whenever I've asked a few times if I could sit in, and the response was, well, yes, we let in researchers as long as they keep their mouth shut. So that was roughly
one of the constraints.
Which is not easy for me, as you've probably noticed. But the idea is really they want to have hands-on real experiences from other companies.
Right.
Whether you build cars or you are in telecommunications or you are in the defense industry or any of the other industries, the journey is the same. I'm adopting Agile, I go to continuous integration, I want to get to DevOps, and that's also happening in the defense industry, interestingly enough. Everyone is trying to get there.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that we started this whole Meet the Authors program, is because we wanted the opportunity for our listening audience, for our members to hear from folks like yourself,
Right.
and to share your knowledge with us. So again, appreciate it. Talk to me now about the last one, ecosystem.
Yes. I will start from another end.
Okay.
We defined something that we've called the 3-layer product model. And what we do is we take a product or a platform or a portfolio, and we categorize the functionality in that product, platform, or portfolio into 3 layers. There is a layer of commodity functionality that you need for your product to work, but no customer is going to pick your product because the commodity functionality. Yeah, when you picked your new mobile phone, the fact that you could make phone calls with your new mobile phone, your new smartphone, did not factor into your buying decision. It's a commodity feature. You would have been really annoyed if you couldn't make phone calls with your new mobile phone.
I think so, yes.
Yes, I think so too. But you didn't pick the phone that you had because you could make phone calls. It's a commodity feature. On top of that, there is a layer of differentiating features. And differentiating features are the things that today drive the buying behavior of your customers. If you look at the mobile phone space, they now are putting more and more cameras on the back. I think Nokia now has 5 cameras. Samsung is coming out with 3. Apple is experimenting with different things. So it's differentiating stuff in order to drive better image quality, higher screens, better screen quality, better visibility in light, high sunlight, etc., etc. And then on top of that, we have a layer of innovative functionality. So that is where I'm trying out the things that will hopefully become my future differentiation.
Okay.
You keep that model in mind. So commodity, differentiation, innovation.
Got it.
We then went to companies and we asked them, how much of your resources are you spending on commodity functionality? And how much of your resources are you spending on differentiating and innovative functionality? And the answer is that the typical company spends 80 to 90% of all their R&D resources on commodity functionality, stuff that you've already had in the product, stuff that no customer cares about. You just need it for your product to work.
Right.
And when you then realize that 8 or 9 out of every 10 people in your R&D organization are working on things that, to be honest, no customer really cares about, then the next question becomes, how do I free myself up? How do I free up my resources to put them on differentiating functionality? And then there are 2 things that are quite important. You can work internally and say, once a component or a layer in the subsystem has been categorized as commodity, I do not accept new functionality requests. I really try at the front end to limit the amount of new feature requests and new requirements and other things that come in to the highest possible point, so that I spend as little time in that layer as possible. But the other part, and this is where the ecosystem comes in, if you can start to partner with other companies to give over the commodity functionality to them to maintain. This is what we see in the open source community. This is what we see in sometimes multiple companies in an industry form a new company that will give them a platform. In the automotive industry, there was Genevi. Genevi had a platform for infotainment systems, which was a Linux-based platform for automotive.
Right.
For infotainment, where then the different member companies could build their own differentiation on top of. Okay. But what you're looking for is, how do I free up resources in commodity so that I can make them available in differentiation? And then there is the other part, which is around innovation. Many companies feel that they have too few innovations entering their differentiation layer. So what many companies are doing, they're moving from internal innovation to much more of a form of open innovation, which is again an ecosystem engagement, because I then engage with my innovation ecosystem. So what I'm looking for is, I'm looking to partner when I innovate. Once I find really valuable innovations, I take it in-house and I protect it, because that is the thing that will drive my sales. And there are all kinds of legal and organizational and relationship with your relationship issues with your innovation partner. But what you try to do is you try to get control about the innovation that is successful, because that's your differentiation. Once it starts to commoditize, and depending on the industry, in mobile games, this can be a few weeks. In automotive, this can be a few years, for instance. Once it starts to commoditize, you basically push it into the commodity layer, and you're open to partnering with others in order to figure out what can I do to still offer the functionality to my customers, but minimize the amount of R&D resource that I have to put in. So sorry for the long monologue.
No, that makes much
sense.
The
ecosystem part is concerned with how do I partner at the innovation level and how do I partner at the commodity level so that I can maximize my resource allocations, my R&D resources, and focus them maximally on the differentiating functionality layer of my products.
Are more and more companies actually doing that? Are you seeing them leveraging the power of the ecosystem together, or do you still see them kind of holding on to what they consider their IP?
So, of course, this is a very difficult journey. I see that especially on the commodity side, there is a lot of much more willingness that has emerged over the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, if you only look at the broad adoption of the open source software communities, where also very large companies like the Volvos and the Ericssons and others in this world are very active, that is a way of sharing the cost of commodity functionality with others in the ecosystem, even by putting in some of my own resources. So we see it happen at the commodity side. If we look at the innovation side, that's where it is much more difficult for many companies. There are many people have three partners that they do innovation with: me, myself, and I.
And then we don't tell each other what we're doing because we don't want them to, sneak out there and tell.
But at the same time, you could view what you are doing with DASA, which is a form of knowledge exchange, and what we do in Software Center, I view as a form of process innovation or technology innovation, depending on how you want to look at it. I mean, we are looking to help companies build software in better ways.
Right.
Companies are coming there together because they want to share the cost of innovation and together figure out how they can, as optimally as possible, get to better ways of working, better tooling solutions, better product outcomes, etc., by partnering with others that maybe are not competitors, but that are still, sorry for the pling, that are still interested in getting, are still looking to partner with each other on accelerating the pace of innovation. You see this happen around processes, tooling, non-critical functionality in the product. If it comes to the key differentiators in the product, that's where we see that there is a lot less willingness to actually partner with us.
I definitely appreciate the analogy, because the reason we started DASA was as an open, kind of members-driven organization, because we knew that there were people out there that wanted to contribute to the dialogue. How do you change from working in a traditional IT way to the new IT way of working?
Right.
And that's what we're trying to do in advance. So all very critical and key points.
Yeah, good.
I wanted to talk to you about something I found very interesting in the book in terms of the Stairway to Heaven.
Yes.
Can you share with my audience about that? I love it. The Stairway to Heaven.
So it started off, I must admit, the name is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I must admit. It started off with a discussion that I had with an Australian gentleman where I claimed that the Stairway to Heaven was a much nicer song than the Highway to Hell. And it was certainly a nicer place to end up as far as I'm concerned. Where his response was, what do you have against Australian music? Because of course, we all both know that AC/DC was the band behind the Highway to Hell.
Right.
And what I was looking to communicate when we started to define this evolution model, where we saw that companies were going through a number of steps, is that at the end of the change journey, you actually are closer to an ideal closer to heaven than what you were before you started, because as we were discussing, and as I know DASA and its member companies are experiencing, change is hard. Change is really difficult. Yeah, so it's not easy to implement these kind of things. So you go through a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, especially for the people that are change leaders. They very often need to struggle so hard to make things happen that I wanted to stress that life really is better once you get to the other side. Yeah, then that's what I was trying to get to. So that was the story behind the Stairway to Heaven. Okay. And as you saw in the book, it started off with the speed dimension. That's what the first one. But what we then did was we added multiple dimensions to this. So there's the speed dimension, the data dimension, there is the ecosystem dimension. We've also been looking a little bit, which is not in the book, but maybe in a future book, around empowerment. So how do companies move to empowerment? I mean, DASA does a lot around Agile, and Agile is a first step towards empowering teams and individuals. And I think that's an important thing to realize. I mean, you mentioned already that business leaders adopted Agile, but what we see is that when organizations adopt Agile, the number of managers is significantly lower, and the relative percentage of valuable contributors is significantly higher after an Agile transformation, because there is more empowerment, more freedom given to teams. Now, what you see is that over time, there is an empowerment dimension to this as well. And the last work, and people can contact me if they're interested, is that we've also started to look into how do AI, how does AI factor into this? Because we see that companies adopt AI in a certain sequence as well. So.
Yeah, we're hearing quite a bit about AI, and I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out how that's going to fit and what they're trying to do. So from a transformation perspective, for a lot of traditional IT organizations, it seems like there's so much that they have to try to keep an eye on, and they don't know where or how to start.
Yeah. So we have defined, a model, which we have called
models.
A holistic DevOps model, where what we're seeing is there are two dimensions to it. The first is there are three types of development. There is traditional requirements-driven development, which will not go away. I mean, I think that there will, in spaces of regulation or for commodity features or for competitive parity features, we will continue to do traditional requirements-driven development. Next to that, we have what we have called outcome or experiment-driven development. That's where you give a team, this is the outcome I'm looking for. Go and run your A/B experiments, your multi-armed bandits, your dark launches, your whatever you want to do, but drive the outcome metric up. And then the third part is in places where I have a lot of data, but I don't have clear algorithms for how to solve a certain problem. Image classification, house price prediction, all kinds of other use cases. We see that companies should adopt AI-driven development. Then I have the data set. I create the machine learning and deep learning models, and it results in components that can be deployed in the system. But those components go into the same system where the requirements-driven components and the outcome-driven components are developed. And not only that, everyone goes through DevOps. So even my machine learning models, and this is with the companies that are the most advanced that we work with, the deep learning models and the machine learning models are retrained every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks and follow the same DevOps process that all the other types of development are doing. And this is what many people that are hardcore data scientists don't see. They spend 95% of their time cleaning up data sets in order to be able to train models. The second is that they think that once they have a first version of a model that performs okay, they're done and they move on. But that's not how it works in the most advanced companies. Then it's a DevOps model. Once you can do prediction or classification with, 95% accuracy, then next month I want to see 96. And then I wanted to get to 96.5, and then I want to get to 97.1, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the model that we see. So, and what companies need to get good at is to identify for every chunk of development that they want to do, decide would the requirements-driven approach fit best to this? Would an outcome-driven approach fit best to this? Or would an AI-driven approach fit best to this? And then bring that together. And that can even change over time. For instance, in one of the companies we work with, if I keep going too long, stop me anytime.
No, I'm loving this.
If there's a product manager that wants some new functionality built and the team is in agreement with the product manager, this is a good idea. They start off based on the spec by the product manager.
Right.
Then they see if it is actually successful. Successful requires knowing what to measure, what does constitute success, what are the factors. So then you become data-driven. And once the first version of the feature is out there and I know what success looks like, then I can shift to an outcome-driven approach. Yes. And then I can say, okay, let me try through A/B experimentation to drive up the different factors that I can have. Once the return on investment of the team running A/B experiments, so most A/B experiments now are no longer successful, then I can say, okay, I've now so much data, let me give this to a machine learning algorithm that will continue to try to improve this. And then maybe at some point the functionality from differentiating becomes commodity. Then I stop investing completely into it. I even stop the AI-driven part, but occasionally there's a bug fix or a change in the standard. So then I use the evolution of that chunk of functionality through requirements-driven development again. So you can see you can over time switch between different ways of working. But it all comes together in one system and the entire system will do DevOps.
That's fantastic. So a question for you. What would be your advice to those senior leaders that are out there that are looking at what they need to do, how they get started with really embracing some of the things that we've talked about and being able to deliver not only on the speed, the data, building the ecosystems to take them to the next level? It sounds like a daunting experience. Is there a way to get them there? I think reading your book is a great start, but what's your advice for them?
I think they should get both of us in for an awareness creation presentation, Deborah.
I love that. Absolutely. Let's sign them up immediately.
Exactly. No, what I see is the way I work with companies, because I do this a bit as well, and I know that you do that as well within DASA.
Absolutely.
I often start with an awareness creation session, where I often present, because the problem that you just described is exactly what most senior leaders are trying to deal with. It's all connected to each other. How do I make sense of this? So that's the first thing. So what I try to do in the book and in the work that we've done outside the scope of the book as well is at least give concrete steps on how to sequence how you are moving forward.
Right.
That's what we do in the speed, data, ecosystem, empowerment, AI, etc. So that's the first thing. Within those dimensions, you can also see that there are certain priorities. You actually first need to get your speed dimension in place, preferably, at least to some extent, because otherwise the data-driven stuff doesn't really help, right? I mean, you need to. That's why DASA is so important. You need to get agile right. Yeah? If you don't have that, if you don't have the fast feedback loops, nothing happens. And then everything takes forever. So get us in, work with us on the dimensions that we were talking about. And then we often talk with the software center companies about a concept that we call shadow beliefs. Shadow beliefs are beliefs that often the leadership team in the company has, that maybe was true at some point in the past. Maybe it was never true, but it is no longer true. And
how easy is that to get people to confess their shadow beliefs?
Yes. It's incredibly difficult because very often even the company identity is connected to the beliefs that the company holds. And the tricky part is, especially with successful startups, a startup is virtually always successful because they believed something that the rest of the world did not believe. Correct. That made them successful. Yes. And then at some point letting go of those beliefs, that things that make us different from everyone else. Many, especially smaller companies, have a bit of a David versus Goliath, all the Goliaths in the world kind of attitude. The biggest factor there for us is use data to prove or disprove what you are actually assuming. That's one. Second, it is almost impossible to do this without outside help, because everyone in the company has drank the Kool-Aid. Everyone in the company believes the same thing. And the people that don't believe the same thing were either ostracized, left voluntarily, or decided to adopt what the company believed was true anyway, because that was the only way that they could function and be successful in the context of the company. So you need outside people that start to poke at the fundamental beliefs that exist in an organization.
And that is hard. You know, I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot is culture.
Yes, yes.
Culture within an organization, and changing culture, changing behavior in order to actually get a clear view of actually what you're facing as you try to move your company. You know, it's like a huge tanker ship. You're trying to turn on a dime to be competitive.
And the interesting thing is, I'm not sure if you read the book Habits.
I have the book. I have it. Have not read it yet. Have it.
The author claims that a typical human being spends, I think, I remember the exact number, but something like 95% of his or her time following habits unconsciously.
I believe that.
The number of times during the day that we make conscious decisions about what we're going to do next and why we're doing this is highly limited. I believe that organizations are worse than human beings. An organization is a set of habits that get enacted by the employees and the people in the organization. You call it culture, and that's, I think, the best word for it. But the culture is a set of habits that we are not even conscious of that we have. We don't even think about it. And that's what you often see. I mean, you can see it when I go out and you go out to presentations where you have senior leaders that come from another mindset. You start to talk in a certain way, and you can see them viscerally react with a sense of distaste.
Oh, yeah.
Because it goes against everything that they believe and everything that they hold valuable and hold to be true. And how do you break through that? Well, one of my responses is never waste a good crisis. Companies are much more receptive when they are in trouble. So that's one. And those are good companies that can change when they get in trouble. For me, great companies are companies that can change before they get in trouble.
Exactly.
That's my viewpoint, at least.
Yeah. You know, I want to just tell you how great it's been to just spend this time with you.
Thank you, Deborah. I really enjoyed
have an opportunity to just talk about, you know, all of this great wisdom and research and experience that you have, and to share it with our audience. I can't thank you enough for your time. I cannot thank you enough for writing such a fantastic book.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and I do want to stress that I'm far from the only one who's working on these things. I know that you and your organization, as well as the others around DASA, are doing a lot of work in this space as well. So I do want to recognize you and the others in your org for driving many of the same changes as what I'm describing in the book.
I'm looking at the boss over here, right? He's the boss of us.
Yes, he's your boss and my boss today. So.
Jan Bosch.
Change is only going faster. So
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.